Hello, this is Chris again, and welcome to part two of the Shroud of Turin story. Again, this is a recording, a pre-recording of a talk I'll be giving to the Anteaters, the University of California Irvine Anteaters, the Catholic group there, at the request of Father Ben. So shout out to Father Ben once again. The first part is recorded. It's a 40-minute segment that brings us up until this part in the story. And I'm going to pick off where I left off and give you the second part of the story. And I'm going to start just with a brief recap of that first part so that we're all aware of where it is that I left off. So, we talked about what the Shroud of Turin was, and this very large 8 cubit by 2 cubits, so 14 and a half feet by 3.5 feet cloth, so very long, very wide, with the unexplainable and mystifying image of a man that appears to have been beaten, scourged, crucified, speared in the chest, and impaled with a crown of thorns. So we talked about the known facts related to the shroud, the mystery, the continuing mystery of how the image that appears on the shroud got there. Okay, it's still unknown. It's still unexplainable. We talked about the difference between the image on the shroud and the blood stains and other markings, for example, the Jerusalem dirt that is found on the shroud. Again, two very different things. The fact that they correlate is amazing, but two very different things. And we kind of went through all of the various amazing facts, whether it be the reality that we now understand that the eye sockets in the face on the shroud are not hollow, but are actually covered by coins, which were minted by Pontius Pilate in the year 29, a very rare coin. We talked about a variety of things that were just simply unexplainable, or examples of just how this could happen, how, for example, someone forging that image could have done what he or she did. We kind of covered quite a bit of that. However, we also talked about how the shroud emerged seemingly out of nowhere in the year 1355 in Liry, France, as a spoil of war, which we did then finally attribute to the Fourth Crusade. However, again, the history that we walked through was one that puts together a potential and I think viable track from Jerusalem through Edessa to Constantinople to Liry, France, eventually Turin, Italy. However, that is something that we had to put together through historical references and some inferences and things of that nature. The reality is the shroud did become popularized when it first showed up in the public sphere, at least in the European public sphere in 1355. And it just so happened that that was a very, very crazed time, a time of relics and pilgrimages and artifacts. And there were quite a few fraudulent activities going on there, and people that were trying to take advantage of the Christian poor and play on their piety. So certainly, definitely something to look at with a skeptical eye. So we did track that path to Turin, from Jerusalem to Edessa to Constantinople, the Templars, the Descharnets to Liry, France, traveling with the Savoys, eventually to Chambray Castle, and then eventually to Turin, Italy, and the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, where it resides to this day. And then we talked about two very fortunate accidents related to the shroud. We talked about Secunda Pia's photographs from 1898, which he made a mistake in the development of those photographic plates, and it was a very fortunate mistake because it revealed that the image on the shroud is actually a photographic negative, and his negatives that he produced as a result of his mistake brought out an amazing amount of detail about the image that could not be seen with the naked eye. We then talked about the 1973 accident with the NASA scientists who were interested in the shroud primarily because of someone's attempt to destroy it a year before by burning it in 1972, and we're also aware of Pia's photographs, and just for fun decide to run those photographs through the VP8 analyzer, which turns a 2D image of a 3D object into a 3D model. And they did not expect anything to come out when they put Pia's photography in or photographs in, because they assumed that the image was created as artwork using some sort of technique that, even though it was unknown, it was a technique created by humans, which means the image was two-dimensional. So hence, even putting it through the VP8 analyzer should not have given it, a 3D result. Yet a 3D result did come out, and this created a firestorm. Again, no pun intended. We reviewed several instances where people attempted to burn the shroud, and also what we believe may have been an accidental fire in 1532, which nearly destroyed it. But anyway, that those two accidents combined, especially that second one, to really set off a firestorm in the late 70s and 80s, where science, modern science now, was reinvigorated with an interest in the shroud. And that's where we left off. We had this desire to now study it, and I stopped it right there. And now we're going to pick up with what happened, how that desire translated into reality. So there was this scramble. Let's unlock the mysteries of the shroud, and as a result, in 1977, the Shroud of Turin Research Project was assembled. It was actually the brainchild of those two NASA scientists, or at least they had a great deal of influence in finally getting this group together. Excuse me for a moment. But the team was assembled, and it was a pretty impressive team. People from a variety of disciplines, scientific disciplines, were on this team. You're talking people also from a variety of religious backgrounds, and that was intentional. All right, that was an intentional objective to actually try to weed out any potential conflicts of interests on this team. So you had Muslims, you had Jews, you had Christians, you had Catholic Christians, Protestant Christians, you had atheists, you had agnostics. And they did that purposely, really, because they wanted to make sure that they could not be accused of having a specific purpose in mind and a bias going into the work that they intended to do. These people were not John Doe scientists. These weren't people from the local community college. These were professionals working for the greatest scientific institutions in the world at the time, many of them right here in the United States. And you can see an abbreviated list of some of them. And I'm sure you'll recognize that, when we're talking about the 1970s and 80s and much of the 20th century, this is where the core of science was to be found. Maybe one that's missing from here would have been Bell Labs, but outside of that, there is no major research institution that probably was not represented on this team. And they determined they were going to have three goals. They were going to, one, determine how old is the shroud. Okay, how old is this cloth? That was number one. Number two, they wanted to know what its place of origin was. Okay, they wanted to know, was this a shroud that was created in Italy, or was this a shroud that was created in Germany, or was this a shroud that was created in Israel? Okay, so woven and put together from materials that would have been available in that geographic location. And then number three, and this was probably the most important one, was they wanted to know how this image was created. So they definitely realized that what they're seeing on the shroud are two different things. They are seeing what appears to be blood and dirt and other things that come from a human body that had been through some sort of really significant trauma, a trauma very much matching the trauma that Jesus Christ himself was described to go through during the Gospels, or in the Gospels. And what they're also seeing is an image of that person that somehow was placed on that shroud that is separate from the blood and the other materials that came from the body the shroud was wrapped around. So they wanted to know where that image came from. And they certainly wanted to make sure that their work would stand up to peer review. So they didn't just slap together some tests. They spent 18 months carefully planning out, minute by minute, protocol by protocol, how they're going to collect the data, how they're going to analyze the data, who was going to analyze the data, how they're going to do peer review. So this is a very well thought out project. They knew they were going to have 5 days, 5 continuous days, 120 hours. So they timed it out minute by minute to maximize what they could do, and ensure that it could be peer reviewed and taken as the results that would be obtained could be taken as pure results. So they arrive in 1978. They begin their 120 contiguous hours of testing and execute that, and they determine, based on all of their tests, that the shroud is indeed a first century linen cloth. Goal number one checked off, with an origin in Palestine. So goal number two chipped off. So the first two goals they clearly met. They believed that there was, without a shadow of a doubt, or beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it's a first century cloth with the origin in Palestine, where Israel is, modern Israel is today, and historic Israel was in the historic past. The image goal number three, they were not at all successful. So they weren't able to say, look, there's no pigments or paints or dyes or stains that were used to create the image. So the normal means of image creation were not employed here. They did confirm, yes, we don't know how, but it does. The image does seem to contain unexplainable, unique three-dimensional encoding. The features such as the blood and scourge marks make it clear that there was direct contact between the shroud and a human body. So this is just confirming what forensic pathologists have been saying for, since Yves Leban, first said it in the early 20th century. So they said, yes, that those marks came from a human body, that they can tell the origin there. But when it comes to the image, again, which is completely separate, they could only conclude that the image is of a real human form, a scourged and crucified man. So there's a direct quote, so I will read it. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin, often give a positive test for the serum albumin. The source of the image is an ongoing mystery, and the problem remains unsolved. Okay, so those were their conclusions. So those are some pretty substantial results. Okay, even though they failed in definitively defining the source of the image, they did give us some great insight into the image, and certainly were successful with their first two goals. So what happens after that? Well, when they released their preliminary results, which they did, even though they said, look, we want to take time now, and their plan was to take a couple of years to analyze all the data they had and do peer reviews and things of that nature, they did issue an initial preliminary report, which basically has gone unchanged. Their additional data review didn't uncover anything additional, but the whole world was buzzing with this. So you could actually see an excerpt from the Sunday New York Times Magazine with the image of the shroud face on it. Article inside, hey, is this for real? Blah, blah, blah. This was big news around the world. In 1981, they were ready to present their official results, and they wanted to present them to the Pope. So this would be Pope John Paul II at that point. And they were scheduled to review them on May 13th, 1981, which happened to be the day that an assassin attempted to kill Pope John Paul II. So just another crazy shroud twist. They never got to present the results to John Paul. 2 years later, the last surviving member of the Savoy family, for whatever reason, it could be, cross-marrying into the same family, but they had massive reproductive problems, and actually the family line died out. The last surviving member bequeathed the shroud to the Pope, and the way it works now is whoever is the current Pope is the physical owner of the shroud, with the condition that the shroud must never be removed from the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. So the Pope owns it. It's his property. Whoever is the Pope, it's his property, but with the idea that they were going to continue to keep it in Turin, so that the Savoy family could repay their debt to Turin. They lived there for so long. They loved the city. They want to make sure its major attraction was not removed. So that is what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Stirp study. A couple of years go by, and Cardinal Balestrero, so now we're at 1987, 4 years later after the Pope became the owner of the shroud. And, a whole system was set up to maintain it and make sure that visitation to the shroud could be controlled. So the church did a good job of putting an organization around it so people could venerate it. Cardinal Balestrero was the cardinal who was in charge of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, and hence the shroud. And he thought it would be a good idea to actually respond to a request to have the shroud carbon dated. So carbon-14 dating had been developed by William Libby back in the 1940s. He won the Nobel Prize for it in the 60s. Between the 60s and the 80s, the techniques and methods around carbon-14 dated really became mainstream and mastered. So they said, hey, look, this is now the recognized method for dating for dating organic materials. Let's just put a stake in the heart of anyone who's still a skeptic and use carbon-14 dating to once again prove that the shroud is a first century linen cloth. So the carbon-14 team got together with the STIRP team. They agreed on a 777 protocol, 7 samples, each sample big enough to cut into 7 smaller pieces because they wanted to send them to 7 labs, and they were going to take each of these 7 samples from a different place on the shroud so that they could, get results that are representative of the entire cloth. They ran the carbon-14 test. There was no real coverage of the test, but there was coverage of the test results. So on October 13th, 1988, the British Museum, who were in charge of the carbon-14 team, announced that the shroud is a medieval hoax, that it's dated to 1260 to 1390. That's what the carbon-14 test results give us. And then Professor Edward Hall, who, by the way, let me just get back to that. By the way, is the gentleman on the left in this image. So you can see he's a very arrogant looking guy, at least in that picture. Gives this really flippant statement. There was a multi-million-pound business in making forgeries during the 14th century. Someone just got a bit of linen, faked it up, and flogged it. So pretty dismissive of the shroud in its entirety. At least he was convinced that the carbon-14 results did indeed put a dagger in the shroud, not the dagger Cardinal Balistrero was hoping for that proved definitively it was a first century cloth and the burial cloths of Christ, but a dagger that once again brought forth all the naysayers that said, this is a fraud. See, this is all a bunch of garbage that, these Catholics are putting out. These Christians are constantly lying to us and manipulating us, and they're trying to hoodwink us and blah, blah, blah. So, the standard run of the mill stuff. But then we say, not so fast, Professor Hall, because as it turns out, the people that were most confused by this were this team of scientists from the STIRP team whose reputations were now on the line. And they're like, wait a second, we ran tests, we ran multiple tests, and we got nothing that indicated what the carbon-14 people are saying here. So they went back and started meeting with the carbon-14 people. And the first thing they found out was what was not related to the public was that the 777 protocol was not executed during this test. As a matter of fact, what happened when they got to the shroud, the custodian of the shroud said, there's no way I'm going to let you cut 7 holes into the shroud. And these would have had to be like at least a 1 inch or so, because they had to cut them into samples from that point. So he said, no way, I'm not letting you do that. And I'm not letting you do any sample near the image itself. So if you're going to take any sample and you can have one, you can have it from around the edge. And that's what they did. They took 1 sample that was only big enough to cut into 3 viable pieces. So they sent that 1 sample to 3 labs. So instead of 7 samples from different places around the shroud, with each sample being broken into 7 pieces and sent to 7 different labs, it was 1 sample that could only be broken into 3 pieces and sent to 3 separate labs. So in addition, they failed to execute, which is what was a standard test that you would always execute during carbon-14 dating, where you do an on-site contamination test to determine just how much carbon that this fiber may have been exposed to after it was produced. So, for example, carbon from smoke, say from fires or candle wax or things like that, would actually inject additional carbon-14 isotopes into the fibers, and hence could distort the test results. So they failed to do that. They had no baseline of which to make adjustments because of the failure of running that additional test. And the piece they took the sample from was from the top left corner, where the Poor Clares, you see our Poor Clare nuns over on the left here working on the shroud. had actually sewed on a new edge around the outer edge of the shroud and a backing. So what the Stirp team did is the Stirp team took a look at their pictures and they realized that the tested section had been repaired and died at some point, likely after that 1532 fire. So this was a piece that they ended up testing was not from the original shroud. So it's a total mess. Okay, it's basically what happened here. And what people started saying is, yeah, oh, great, your test said that the fibers you tested were from about 1350. Yeah, probably the Port Clare nuns looked for an old linen cloth that had been discolored and faded so that they could sew it on to repair the actual linen cloth, which was quite, excuse me for a moment. Billy, stop. He gets excited when I talk to Shroud. But we're not the original Shroud. So, and then in addition, after this, as this news came out, Carbon 14 dating experts also then expressed their concern that it would be even possible to date the Shroud because of how many years it had been exposed to the elements, how many people had handled it, how often it had been in the presence of smoke from fires, how many times it itself had been burned. They just said, look, it's very unlikely that any sort of carbon 14 dating, regardless of the protocol, would have produced reliable results. So, a lesson to be learned there is smugness never goes unpunished, and hard science ends up correcting itself. And that's what ended up happening here. Because as time went on, additional tests were made. We have the Fenty test from 2012, 2013. All three tests actually produced results that put the shroud clearly into the first century. So very much aligned with what the Stirp group had come up with. You then later, so I mentioned this in the agreed upon facts, you had the comparison with the Sudarium. This actually happened in the 2000s as well, which, clearly made it obvious that the shroud at the very least comes from the 6th century. So once again, slapping the carbon 14 dating away, saying it couldn't have been any later than the 6th century because of the concurrence with the Sudarium and the match on the blood and serums. And, it was clear these two cloths were in contact with the same human at the same time. And the provenance on the Sudarium is just so clean and so unquestionable that, again, the carbon 14 dating results were just actually laughed at this point. Then you get more. 2017, back to our friends at the British Museum, there was a young master's student who was pursuing his master's in statistics who decided to use the shroud data, which was publicly available through the journal Nature. It's where most scientific data was published at the time, as his basis for his master's thesis. And when he started analyzing the data, it became clear to him that there was something missing from the data set. It's almost as if pieces of the data were pulled out. So his assumption was that this was done by the journal Nature and Expedients trying to save space in their publication. So he contacted Tristan contacted the British Museum and asked for the complete data set, but they denied him. They denied him so many times, he finally filed a Freedom of Information Act in the European Union, of which the UK and the British Museum was forced to comply. When he got the data, he realized his findings were correct and that the British Museum had only released some of the data to the journal Nature, and that the data they did not release actually disputed the conclusions reported that they reported back in 1988. So this was a huge scandal. It continues to be a scandal because it brought into question many other data sources that the British Museum was supposed to be safeguarding, and has resulted in a flurry of information, freedom of information requests so that people can determine if the British Museum was involved in other biased reporting of test results, scientific test results. Moving forward, the latest and greatest technology for identifying the age of organic materials is wide-angle X-ray scattering, currently thought to be much more reliable, actually, than carbon-14 dating. And this was done. This was done in 2019, 2022. with amazing clarity of results showing that the shroud itself is around 2,000 years old, okay, which puts it right at the time of Christ. It also gave them a potentially different path. They thought instead of Edessa that it would be Beirut that the shroud traveled through, but that is now something that the pollen scientists and these X-ray dating scientists are actually debating back and forth. It's unclear whose results may be right or wrong on that front, but they do agree again on the dating and the vast majority of what we've proposed as the travel from Jerusalem to Liri, France, and on to Turin. So then the question becomes, could this thing have been forged? Okay, so let's address it. In order to forge it, a forger would have got to have a 1,300-year-old linen cloth in the 14th century. Linen cloths did not survive that long, so to find one would have been nearly impossible. You would have traveled with it to specific locations around the world where the shroud was going to be thought to be for some reason, and spend enough time there to get the pollen concentrations he needed, assuming that somewhere in the future this pollen technology would be developed, because it didn't exist back in the 14th century. So this forger would have been able to, or had to predict scientific advancements that did not exist in his age. That's not the only one, by the way. You have to find someone with the right blood type to beat, torture, crucify, upright, by the way, because you need to get the right blood drippage, and spear using authentic first century Roman weapons. So he's not only a forger, but a cruel murderer, and someone who seemed to have access to archaeological finds that's just simply amazing. He would then have to rub the body with Jerusalem dirt, just the right places after he killed this poor guy. He would then have to ignore everything that anyone of his age knew about crowns and recognize that someday we would discover that the crowns of the first century were skull caps. Again, this was a 20th century discovery, so a 14th century forger should not have known this, but he actually made sure his image represented that. So that's something that is, again, amazing that this forger is also a master archaeologist and predictor of scientific breakthroughs and knowledge. He'd have to put the body on the cloth to get the blood smears and get the dirt to be transferred and all this kind of good stuff. And then somehow remove the body without distorting any of these markings, something that all of the forensic scientists that have studied the image said did not happen. So he'd have to figure out how to do it to fool these guys. So he somehow was able to do something that is impossible for us to do today, put the body down, get the blood smears and dirt marks and all the other bodily fluids transferred, then lift the body off the shroud without messing up any of that transfer. So pretty amazing. He'd then have to go on and have an unknown technique, create a technique that has never been replicated, was never used again, either before or after this, to create the image after removing the body so that he could create the image on the shroud. He'd have to make sure that in doing so, he matched the head and facial blood smears and positioning of the image with the Sudarium of Oviedo, an item he would have had no way of coming into contact with because it was securely guarded in a separate country, okay? And you never got within more than 15, 20 yards of it. So pretty amazing was able to do that. He would have to locate a sample of that very limited minted Pontius Pilate coin that no one knew existed to the 20th century. This wasn't 14th century knowledge. And he would have had to use that because he would have been predicting that digital photography would be invented in the 20th century. So again, this guy knew something about upcoming science. I wish he would tell us who's going to win the Super Bowl. And then, of course, he would have to anticipate 3D image analysis would be invented. That's why he would deliberately encode his image with 3D encoding, something we don't know how to do, but I guess he would have known how to do, and he knew he needed to do it to fool the 20th century scientists. He would have to pull all this off without leaving a trail, telling no one, leaving no potential notes or records or evidence of any kind that he did this. He'd have to never use this technique again, despite the fact that it's clearly amazing, and he would have been rich beyond his wildest dreams producing forgeries of this nature. He would have, and again, just let me see here. Is there anything else? No, those are the 10 things the forger would have to do. Sorry about that. So again, I think you realize, some of this I'm doing tongue in cheek, but it's all factual. There's no way this could have been forged. Okay. There's, the people that are still claiming that, no, this is a forged image. They have no basis for that. As a matter of fact, if they look at the real facts, they'd be embarrassed even thinking that. So that's the reality. So we're back to this image now. How did this thing get created? And there is a hypothesis. So the way that science works is you propose a hypothesis, you try to produce tests that would allow you to test that hypothesis. If you can get a reproducible results, and you should, okay, be able to, either for or against your hypothesis, it becomes a theory, a working theory. And we have a hypothesis that has some tests done that give us a limited theory. So the hypothesis is the image could have been created on a linen cloth if there was an extremely short ultraviolet burst of radiation, or a burst of ultraviolet radiation emitted from inside the body outwards from all points of the body simultaneously. Now, that may sound a little crazy to you, but it's a hypothesis. It's like, what would it take? Would this create the image? And, by itself, actually, no, as crazy as that first part is, the body would actually have to be disintegrating as this happened, because in order for the cloth to have the 3D encoding, the cloth would have had to have been falling through the body as the image was being created, so that encoding could be picked up as it fell through different pieces of the body as the body was itself decomposing. So pretty amazing thing, pretty amazing hypothesis. And you're like, is this even possible? Well, they've run some limited tests by blasting reflective objects under linen with an eczema laser, and are able to actually get some results. I would say they're very limited tests at best, from what I understand, so I'm not going to hang my hat on this yet. But it does seem to point in direction that this is possible. However, these tests have told them that it would take an enormous amount of ultraviolet light, something along the lines of 14,000 eczema lasers worth of ultraviolet light, and that's more lasers than we have on the planet. So it's still not possible, even if this is true, for us to even try to replicate it at full scale. They also said that with that much light beaming out at once, it would be, immediately, rising to temperatures we could only imagine. So you'd have to control this light pulse so it was extremely short, 1/40 billionth of a second. Otherwise, it would simply fry everything. Okay, so again, incredible amount of ultraviolet light coming from the body for an incredibly short time duration that had to be explicitly controlled. Incredible precision. We could not do this today. And if it's true, if this hypothesis is true, and it's the only one that's actually still out there that hasn't been disproven, if anything, people are scrambling to see if they can run larger and larger tests to validate it. But if this is true, it means that sometimes after this person was killed and wrapped in the shroud, and the blood dried on the shroud, the decomposing body emitted a powerful burst of ultraviolet radiation from every point within itself at the same time, while simultaneously becoming mechanically transparent. Gotta tell you, that's something that no bodies do, very few at least. This may be the only one. It's the only one that we have this hypothesis for. And I actually think in some ways, and I'm going to do this a little tongue in cheek, I think it's God's sense of humor is being displayed here. Because as Jesus told of himself in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 12, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And we know what he's talking there. You follow in my teachings and you will have eternal life. But as with many things in the Bible, it can have multiple meanings. And I just am left to wonder, is Jesus trying to joke with us a little bit here, knowing that someday we'd start to figure out how this image was created, and just letting us know that, yes, I am the light of the world, because he certainly was, if this image hypothesis is correct. So what's my opinion? What is it? It's the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, and it's a gift of God to help our unbelief. And I hearken back to that moment in the Gospels when the Father presents Jesus with his son who's possessed by a demon and essentially, throwing himself into fires and down into holes and, killing himself. And he says, if you can help me, Jesus, please do so. And Jesus is kind of taken a little back. What do you mean, if? I'm God, I can do anything. And Jesus replies to him, well, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. So he's sort of ribbing him back, saying, well, if you think it's if I can do it, I'm saying if you can believe. And the man has the best response ever. He goes, Lord, I believe, just help my unbelief. And I actually think that's what this is. I think this is a gift that God has given us to help our unbelief, much like the tilma from Our Lady of Guadalupe, which has a different type of mysterious image on it. I think from time to time, God will give us one of these great gifts just to help us overcome our unbelief. And, you see Pope John Paul II here sitting in front of the shroud in Turin. He believed, okay? He believed in the shroud. Benedict believed in the shroud. Francis believes in the shroud. The church will not officially come out and say one way or the other if this is the burial cloth of Jesus. It's not how the church operates. But it's clear, okay? I believe that that's exactly what this is. And is that important for our faith? Of course it is. It's a great reminder of God's love for us, and it gives us an image of our living God. I want to know what Jesus looks like, and that's it. Okay. So yeah, does it matter from that perspective? It does. But from a different perspective, yeah, no, it doesn't. Because while it can help us overcome our unbelief, intellectual belief is actually not faith. It's just intellectual belief. I mean, the demons believed in Jesus. Believing in him is one thing. Deciding to become an intentional disciple means you've received God's grace and you've accepted it and you're willing to put it into action. Only God can call us to faith. Only God can give us the grace we need to overcome our own human weakness. And we must freely accept and surrender to that grace. That's our role. So again, from that perspective, no, it does not matter. It's a great gift to us. It's one of what I think are many gifts that God has given us to help us. But history has proven time and time again, excuse me, sorry about that, that, no matter how many of these proofs we have or these miraculous events or evidences we have, it doesn't matter. There will always be people that deny them. Think of Fatima, 70,000 eyewitnesses, many of whom were not religious at all. And that wasn't enough. You think in Jesus' own time, he's walking and talking amongst these people, and most of them didn't believe him. They saw it firsthand. So I don't think this is, this is the slam dunk that's going to bring everyone to Christianity and the Catholic Church. I think this is a great tool. I think it's a great gift of God. It should give us tremendous peace of mind and hope and clarity that he does indeed love us and that he does indeed want us to join him. And some people will accept that and surrender to it, and others will not. So what do you think? Is this the face of Jesus Christ? Think about it. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.